Welcome everyone to our webinar today on calculating emissions from transportation and distribution. Today we're going to be sharing with you a new feature set that we're releasing for calculating these emissions. We'll start with a little bit of background on what are these emissions, what category of emissions are we talking about, and then I'll hand it over to my colleague Jasmine, who will give us a demo in our app of this new feature set. As a reminder, there is a Q&A button at the bottom, so if you have any questions, feel free to plop them in there, and we'll try to get to them at the end. I'm Nicholas Sontag, Senior Manager for Sustainability here at Sustain.Life. I build a lot of the accounting rules and logic that go into our tools, and I'm joined by Jasmine Zhuang. Jasmine, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm Jasmine Zhuang, Head of Product here at Sustain.Life, and I work across multiple of our teams, including the sustainability team, the design and engineering teams, to build out all of the features and functionality you see in our application.
Great, thanks. So as always, when we're talking about calculating emissions, we want to start by grounding ourselves in the greenhouse gas protocol so we know what emissions we're talking about. And so today we're really talking about two Scope 3 categories of emissions, transportation and distribution. There are two categories because you have transportation and distribution that occurs on both the upstream and the downstream side of your value chain. I'll get into the distinction between upstream and downstream in a moment, but just more broadly, these categories of emissions include basically emissions from the movement of goods to, from, or within your organization in vehicles or facilities that are not your own. So if you are delivering goods to your customers or moving goods between your facilities in your own vehicles, then that's going to fall under Scope 1 or Scope 2 if they're electric vehicles. And for these categories, we're really talking about third-party emissions. So this includes common parcel carriers like UPS and FedEx and DHL. These categories of emissions also include the storage of your goods. So maybe you're paying for warehousing space to store your goods, or even if your goods are being sold in retail stores, specifically retail stores that are not your own, the emissions of those retail stores actually fall within transportation and distribution because they're emissions that occur ultimately in distributing your product to the final customer. And so the activity data that we're working with for these categories are shipment level data, like origins and destinations and weights of your shipments, as well as just total volumes and weights of how much you're storing in retail stores or in warehouses. When it comes to distinguishing between upstream and downstream, a lot of people get a little confused by this because initially you would think that, okay, upstream transportation and distribution is that is related to my suppliers getting things to me, and downstream transportation and distribution is that which is related to me getting things to my customers. But it's actually not as clean cut as that. And the reason for that is because even if you're sending goods to a customer, let's say you're using something like UPS to ship a good to your customers, and you're paying UPS for that service, then in that arrangement, UPS is is literally a supplier for you. You're paying UPS for their logistics services. And for that reason, that type of shipment actually is an upstream transportation and distribution. And so we define the two categories as following. So upstream transportation and distribution is that which is from purchased products that your suppliers are sending to you. So that's regardless of who's paying for that. So supplier related transportation. And it's also the emissions from the transportation of your sold products to your customers when you are paying for that transportation because it's a purchase service. And then downstream transportation and distribution is essentially everything else, which is the transportation of your sold products to your customers when you do not pay for it. So we can imagine a situation where you're an e-commerce company and you're selling direct to consumers. If you are offering free shipping on your website, then that means you as the company are paying for the shipping. And so the transportation from those sales would fall under upstream transportation and distribution. And if you charge your customers for the shipping, then in that case, they're paying for it even if you are procuring it for them. And that would fall under downstream transportation and distribution. And we can summarize these rules in a table like this. So across the top, we have the different types of shipments that you may have within your operations. And then along the rows, we have, whether you are paying or not. So as I just said, purchase goods from your tier one or your immediate suppliers. Doesn't matter who's paying. That falls under upstream because those are supplier related shipments. For goods that you're selling to your customers, then we look at who's paying for that shipping. If you're paying, it's upstream. If you're not paying and your customer is paying, then it's downstream. And then finally, we have intra-company shipments. So you may be moving things between your own facilities with third-party carriers or shippers. If you're paying, that's upstream. If you're not paying, I actually have NA here because, first of all, it seems like fairly unlikely that you'd be moving things between your own facilities and you would not be the one paying for it. If that does occur, then I think that would depend on the circumstances of those shipments. And so this is more of a case by case thing, even though it's probably would end up being downstream. And then a little bit of information on our approach to calculating these emissions. Our methodology is based on a framework from the Global Logistics Emissions Council, also known as GLEC. GLEC is a partnership of over 100 different companies that came together to synchronize how they calculate and report logistics emissions. So it includes companies like logistics providers like UPS and DHL and FedEx, but it also includes large retailers and large consumer packaged goods brands that manage their own logistics. The framework is consistent with the greenhouse gas protocol. It just goes to a much deeper level of detail for how to calculate emissions. And because the majority of our users are not logistics providers, what we've done is distilled out and generalized the relevant parts of the framework for a non-logistics company to use. In terms of our calculation approach, our primary approach is a distance-based approach, which means that for shipments, you provide us with origins, destinations, and weights. Based on the mode of that shipment, we then calculate the distance for you, which is probably the most time-consuming step of this type of calculation. So we do that automatically for you. From that, we calculate the ton mileage, and then we pull from our global set of emission factors to apply the correct factor based on the mode and the location and calculate your emissions. If you don't have origins and destinations, but you do have spend data, which is less ideal, but you can calculate emissions from it, then we can also do a spend-based emissions calculation. And then finally, something that came out in our research was that many companies do not have downstream data for their downstream transportation and distribution. And that's because, that is transportation that they may not be procuring themselves or purchasing at all. And they may not have any insight into it. You can imagine a situation where if you are selling to a large retailer, that retailer may just send a truck to your warehouse to receive the goods, and you don't have any information on where that truck is going. And so in cases like this, we can actually estimate your downstream transportation and distribution based on your upstream shipping patterns. And this is something that we've actually seen a couple large consumer packaged goods brands do themselves. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jasmine to run us through a little demo in our app.
Great. Thanks, Nick. So I'll go ahead and share my screen and walk through a demo of our new transportation distribution calculator feature. Okay. So as a reminder, Sustain.Life is a platform that helps companies measure, manage, and report their environmental impact, namely their carbon emissions. So if you start on our homepage, you'll see how each of the categories that you can measure activities for in our application contributes to your total carbon footprint and where they lie in terms of scope 1, 2, and 3. So you can see upstream and downstream transportation and distribution both lie within scope 3 here, and you can see how they contribute to the larger whole. So with that, I'll dive into the calculator itself. So as a reminder, to reiterate the 3 new features of this calculator that Nick just pointed out, instead of having to collect and pre-aggregate data about your shipments offline, which you would have had to do previously. You can now just provide an upload with a list of your shipments and we'll do all the calculations, including distance calculation for you. You can also provide spend as a backup. And then lastly, you can always toggle on whether or not you have full or partial downstream data, and we can extrapolate for you if you don't. So to start, you'll configure the preferences for what applies to your organization. So you'll probably have upstream and downstream shipping. In that case, you can toggle both of those on. And then this is the question that has to do with whether you have complete data for your downstream shipments or not. If not, you can toggle that off. And again, we can calculate for you and extrapolate based on your total downstream weight and your upstream shipping patterns. If you do, in this case, I'll just leave it toggled on because I do have complete data for my downstream shipments. And then, as Nick mentioned before, warehousing, storage, and retail are both part of these categories as well. Warehousing is part of upstream and retail is part of downstream. What you'll have to do here is provide the average weight or volume of goods stored in both ambient and refrigerated conditions. And we'll be able to calculate those resulting emissions for you based on the time range that you've provided. So now I'll start a new, so let's say for my New York location, I want to track data for the calendar year of 2022. Again, you need to provide the date range because in calculating warehousing and retail emissions, we need to know what time period it applies to. And also in the case where we're extrapolating data for you, we also need to know what time range we're extrapolating for. But otherwise, the bulk of this is in terms of the file upload that you'll provide. You can download a template here, and I'll just show you an example of what that looks like. So this is a set of sample data. As Nick mentioned, you'll provide a few details about each of the shipments. So shipment date, weight, unit of measure you can provide across the multiple of different units of measure, origin address, destination address. And then in the case of air shipments, you'll be providing the closest origin and destination airports. It doesn't have to be the exact ones. It can just be the one that's closest and it will be generally accurate. In the case that you don't have weight and origin and destination address, you can just plug in the spend here. So you'll see for these shipments, I only have spend. And then you'll need to categorize by both mode of transport, which is air, rail, sea, or road, and then the type of upstream or downstream shipment. A few other things to note. We just really need the zip code and the country in order to calculate distances. But for more accuracy, you can always provide the street address, the city, and the state and province as well. Okay, so from here, I'm going to upload that. We'll do a quick pre-processing step and then just show you a preview of your file so you can validate that everything looks good, that this is the correct file, and then you can proceed to a calculation. For this case, I'm just going to show you what happens when you finish uploading that file, as well as entering some data about your warehousing and retail. At that point, you can then save. And I'll just show you an example so we don't need to wait. But at that point, your file will process and we'll do all the calculations, look up the proper emissions factors based on where those shipments are taking place or what type of mode of transport. And then this is an example of data I've already uploaded for the last year. So this is 2022 data for New York. You'll see some high-level information here. So what was the total weight or volume of your shipments? What was the total spend? And then the resulting emissions in terms of metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And then here on the left side, you'll get a slightly more granular breakdown based on downstream or upstream categories, as well as the mode of transport. So you can get a quick bird's eye view here of how your total emissions break out across those categories. A few more drill downs that you can do. So you may be curious how each of your shipments or groups of shipments contribute to your total emissions. So you can click in here for a more detailed and granular drill down where you'll be able to see the emissions related to each of your shipments. So you can see each of these as an individual shipment. You'll see the related information about where it came from and where it went, and then your total emissions here. You can always sort by your highest emissions to lowest or look for a specific origin or destination. This is pretty granular exploration if you want to look at a shipment level. But probably the more helpful place to go is our analytics dashboard, which you can go to here. Through the analytics dashboard, you'll be able to see some of those same high-level metrics, total emissions, breakdown by upstream and downstream. But you'll also see more granular breakout where you can track your emissions over time, how those are trending month over month, how your spend on shipments is trending month over month, a detailed pie chart breakdown of between upstream and downstream emissions, what modes of transport, and then including warehousing and retail that your emissions are coming from. And then a deep dive into your shipments themselves. And this is where you can gain some insights, not just about the total emissions, but about what's contributing most to your emissions in these categories. So for example, in this tab, you can see that despite my rail and road weight being the highest, and you can also see that most of my distance comes from road and rail as well, the emissions intensity, which is metric tons of CO2e over miles or metric tons of CO2e over my total weight unit, is highest for air, which makes sense. And so through this, you can start to get an understanding of your shipments are contributing in terms of intensity. And then this tab shows you an interesting breakout of your top 10 origin and destination addresses by associated emissions. So where you see these bigger circles, you have the higher emissions output that's associated with those addresses, and the smaller ones are a little bit more scattered, but they have smaller emissions amount. So this, again, is a great bird's eye view of some of your most common shipping patterns, as well as how they contribute to your overall footprint. And the last thing you can do here is really just dive into specifics of your transportation and distribution emissions, whether it's month over month, and this is at a subcategory level, or if you want to get into that same view and be able to download this out of the application, maybe make some of your own visualizations, this is all to be viewed and downloaded out of our analytical dashboard. And to close it out, I'll just go back to our main dashboard to show you again. What I just calculated here falls under our transportation and distribution category, which you can see here, along with the rest of our categories, contributes to this total emissions for 2022. And you can see the breakout here as well as view a quick summary of your subcategory breakdown. So with this feature, you're able to quickly and easily gather shipment data, enter it into the system, and have us do the heavy work to calculate distances and emissions that you can then use in reporting, or using the analytical dashboard, you can gain some insights about your most emissions intensive activities and work on reducing them over time. So with that, I think we'll move over to questions.
Great. Jasmine, we got a question here on locations, how uploads go into different locations or how they get split up.
Yeah, so we have built location support into this calculator. So you can choose to allocate your emissions to a specific location. If you only have a master list of shipments across your entire company, you can also just choose your company headquarters and allocate them there. But if you do want that level of break, we can support that as well.
Great. And then we also got a question here on, does upstream rail transportation have a different emission factor than downstream? The answer is no. Whether it's upstream or downstream doesn't have any bearing on the emission factor or even the emissions that we calculate. It's really just about what bucket do we categorize those emissions in the end.
Okay, I see one question. How long does it take after uploading the data to get the return information? So I didn't want to walk through that on the demo, but it typically should only take a few minutes, depending on the amount of information that you have. You can also navigate away from the page and wait for the email to arrive. So if you do happen to have thousands or hundreds of thousands of rows, you don't need to sit and wait for it to load. You can always be notified and come back once the results are ready, but it should be within a few minutes or within the hour, depending on how much information you have.
And then we have a question here, not as directly related to transportation and distribution, but does our tool allow for tracking of other environmental key activity indicators such as water intensity and waste? We have several parameters we'd like to track in addition to GHGs. Yeah, so we have calculators where you can track water use and your waste production. Not only will it calculate emissions from that, but we also track indicators for diversion rate and water use intensity and things like that. Yeah, we have a question here, not fully understanding the question, but what is the source of the database? Do we accept from third parties, and do we categorize contaminants within emissions themselves? So maybe the database you're referring to is our emission factor data set. So that's a data set that we maintain. There are many different sources for that. And many of the emission factors in that set are actually ones that we have developed ourselves. But as I mentioned, for this particular calculator, we look to the GLEC framework, which refers to a few different sources for emissions data. And then in terms of categorizing, we categorize our emissions into the different Kyoto gases, and so can provide outputs based on, what the different gases that are being produced. Sometimes for scope 3, we don't have that level of granularity. That just nobody has that level of granularity. So we only have CO2e, and sometimes that's the best that we have to work with. Yeah, so we have a question here. Are calculations based on a single delivery or sort of a multi-stop route? So, for example, a UPS vehicle making more than one delivery, how does that work for calculating the distance? So again, based on recommendations from the GLEC framework, we actually add basically a little bit of a factor to what is called the shortest feasible distance. So when we're calculating the distance for road, we calculate the shortest feasible distance between two locations based on the available roadways, and then we add a factor, and that factor is there in order to account for deviations from the shortest feasible distance. So it's a way for us to approximate, the actual route that might be taken. And then a final question here: as transportation methods change, will we be updating new options to choose when entering data? If our fleet of trucks isn't completely electric, can we include that information? The first thing I would say is if your fleet of trucks is completely electric, we're talking about vehicles you own, then that actually doesn't fall under this calculator. Again, recall that transportation distribution is about third-party vehicles. And so if you have your own fleet of electric vehicles, that is something that we can track, within the vehicle section of our application. As third-party vehicles, as organizations like Amazon and UPS start to electrify their fleets, that will be reflected in updates to our emission factors. Okay, just reading through the questions here. Yeah, quick question here. Is the session recorded? Yes, it is recorded, and this will be sent out. Recording will be sent out to participants afterwards. And then we have a question from William here. Our upload will not have airports nor spend, but all other fields. Is that considered complete data or not? That would be considered an incomplete if you have shipments that you are aware of, but you don't have rows in your data set, then we would consider that incomplete. And in general, the process of greenhouse gas accounting is a constant process of data improvement. And so, you start with what you have and then work on obtaining complete data for the next year. Final question here: do you make an allowance for the return to depot journey? So, for example, a truck is making a delivery to you and then is returning back to the depot, and those emissions actually are not included within this category, even though they are sort of related to the shipment. But just following the framework that I referenced earlier, those would be excluded. If there are any other questions that trickle in, we'll try to answer them over email. But I think that wraps up our webinar today. So thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in our app.
Thanks, everyone.